is being put on by Chopsticks Alley Art, which is an incredible organization that promotes cultural heritage, Southeast Asian cultural heritage specifically, by supporting and spotlighting artists in our community through exhibits, classes, festivals, programs, and so much more. On this call, we also have Trami Nguyen Krone, who is the founder and the director of Chopsticks Alley Art. So to give you a brief overview, we are going to have a 45-minute lecture and then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. For this event, we are going to mute attendee mic so we can all hear the speaker, but we would love to see your faces, so feel free to keep your cameras on if you would like. Once the lecture begins, we also encourage you to share your thoughts and your questions in the chat box. Please also note this event is being recorded. The whole event over chat. So before we begin, I would like to share a little bit about Jenny Do, as she is a woman who wears many hats. She is an attorney, an executive director of the Friends of Hugh Foundation, and a long-term art curator and activist. We have asked her to come speak today because of her dazzling contributions as an artist, a curator, and a voice for Vietnamese culture and art in the Bay Area. As you may know, she founded the Ao Dai Festival, which is one of the largest celebrations of Vietnamese culture in the Bay. And she also founded the Green Rice Gallery, which is also a home for Vietnamese American contemporary art. She has sat on the City of San Jose's Arts Commission, and she has curated many very well-received exhibits throughout the Bay Area. Her work as an artist and a philanthropist and a force for social change has earned her recognition as the Trailblazer recipient for Women of the Year in 2007 and also in 2015, bestowed by the California Legislature. And she is truly a leader who has overcome so much, and we are thrilled to have her today. So I am going to mute myself so that Jenny can take over.
So I will go ahead and share my screen now. Cool. Let me see. So hello everyone, even though I can't hear you, but I'm trying to look at your faces on the screen. I am really good as a lecturer, feel the feedback and the energy from my audience. So feel free to make facial expressions. If I say something you like or something you don't like, to give me some feedback. I'm Jenny Do, and thank you so much, Esther, for a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much, Chopsticks Alley, for putting this shows up, and especially Trami Nguyen. You have been giving me so many opportunities to share what I'm so passionate about with the audience, with the Vietnamese American audience, as well as the general audience in San Jose. So today, I'm so honored to be on this call. And first and foremost, I want to say that I am not an expert, but I am an art activist and who love to dig into facts, and my interest with art, it has been since I was a child. Even though I'm an art history degree holder, but I'm still a student, for ongoing. So the facts that I present here today, it's just for fun. It's not intended as an educational thesis. So do not look in too much into it. And since the time that we have together is so short, so I can't only pick, generalizing overall and using a very, very small area to identify, to depict the differences between Eastern and Western philosophy in classical art. So we look at today just on the visual arts, and especially in landscape art. Should we start, folks? So number one is a slide I say the search for boundaries, and this is in terms of for the spirit of Western art. Western art is always about searching for something new, depicting reflecting the experience of life and the individualism concept. and the search is always say, how can we make it better? How can you express it better? How can you break the boundaries? But that's not the case in classical arts, in the Eastern philosophy. So before we go into the differences, I like to, step back a bit about the philosophy in Western, Eastern, and Western art. So in philosophy-wise, let me go forward here. In philosophy-wise, if you don't understand the philosophy differences between the East and the West, then you kind of miss the point. And for me, I started out the search by asking the questions of, why there is no existence of art history in Vietnamese art, in Chinese art. And it took us a long time to have a discipline. So there was not such a thing. It's called, art history in Asian culture, because art was not starting out as a discipline, but it started out originally as a mean to depicting of training oneself in the skill of calligraphy, in the skills of craftsmanship, to design things for human life, to support life, not so much about expressing the idealism until much later. But to start out the cultural context, then when you look at the art, you say, oh, I get it, because the culture is embedded in all our work, and especially in classical art. So to start out, if in the West, and again, I borrowed this slides from a modern artist who looked at it. It's like, there are some fundamental differences between the Eastern and Western cultures. And again, this is oversimplified, but I think it's a fun slide for us to get a quick concepts of what the differences between East and West. So in the Western world, when you say what you mean, again, this is in general, right? If you say, I want this, then it's a straightforward from point A to point B. But in Eastern culture, you may not want to go out and say that directly. If you want something, sometimes you have to go around and around to say what you mean. Sometimes there's this generalization as that, like, oh, you have to read between the line when people say what they mean. So that is for the Eastern. You don't, let's say if business people get together to discuss business deal, you don't go in and straightforward say, hey, I want to buy 100 cows from you. Rather, they talk about the weather, they talk about each other's family, they talk about things that are to show the character, so that businessmen can judge one another. What kind of man are you? What kind of person are you? Before they make the deal. So again, there's that differences. Like, things are not straightforward as it seems. In the West, there is a lot of emphasis on individualism. The human is everything. Man is a representation of the image of God, and so man is important, and the individual is important. So everything is emphasized on individual. Versus in the East, it's all about the collective rights. It's all about the society. The country is everything. The nation is everything, and it's not about the individual. The individual is just an element of the society, and so he or she is not being focused in. This is why you have a lot of self-portraits in the Eastern, the Western art, in the classical art. Lots and lots of portraits, especially for important people that have wealth or so forth. But for the Eastern, mostly no. In the classical art, in the same contemporary time, the emphasis is never about human, about the individuals. In the West, leaders is considered as, you represent the people. You represent, so you are not important. You are one of us. So leaders is equal to the rest of the society. But in the East, the leaders, like, being looked at, idolized, worshipped, so almost like a god. So that's also the fundamental difference between the two. Again, in the West, things are, you know, always based on formula. Things are usually boiled down into a succinct format. But in the East, it's all over the map sometimes. And then just look at the traffic and you will see, you know, I always simplify this and say, you know, just look at the traffic in the in the West society, and the traffic in the East society. But the difference is the Eastern way, it's kind of like look like a maze and it's a mess, but it's somehow it works and people don't fight with each other as much. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, so in the West, you know, you see an obstacle, you see challenges, you go right ahead, you know, head to head with the challenges, right? But in the East, you have to live like water, like Lao Tzu said, you know, live like water. You don't go over the challenges, you go around it, and you keep doing it. Eventually, you get what you want. In the West, if you don't like someone, you show it. It's in your face. In the East, you're still smiling, even though you thought, I'm just gonna kill you, but you know, it will not show on your face. You still keep your smile and composure. So the philosophy of the East is, you know, you look at, I'm sorry, this is a slide, it's a little bit, I made a mistake. You know, I have a dyslexia, so sometimes I got things swapped. So on this slide, folks, it should be, the East should be the West. Sorry about that. So the West, the focus is on Christianity. So Christianism play a major part in the West classical art. And that usually depicting the relationship between the artist and God, the society with God. And the art is usually to show how close you are with God. But in the East, it's not so much focused on, again, I'm focusing on the classical art, not the modern art. In the East, it's more, the religion is Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. But I want to say that these are not religions. They are philosophy of life. Buddhism were not originated as a religion. It was not meant to be as a religion. Buddha never asked to be prayed or to be worshipped. He just asked that everybody should be awake with him. And it was Alexander the Great that went to India. And it was the Greek concepts of depicting iconic figures of Buddhism. That's why Buddhist images emerged. It was through that. In the original time, there was no iconic depictions of Buddhism or Buddhas. So the concept here is that you are part of nature. Nature is almighty. And religion is not really, that didn't really exist. It's rather, it was rather using nature as because nature is so grand and human is just part of nature. And it was through that, you know, ancestor worshipping was the key, but it was never about a religion. It took many centuries for Buddhism to become a religion. So the next one, this is where I would like to go in to see the differences in terms of painting. Let's, you know, in the sense of the concept of art itself is so different between East and West, because originally the Eastern arts was never looking at art as something that you depict for decorative purposes. When it first started out, both East and West using art as a means to, like craftsmanship, right? To create things that support life. And then it evolved eventually into something that depicting the self. For the Eastern art, it started out as a way how to learn to cultivate the self. And so using calligraphy was a way for the intellect to show, I can read, I can paint. And paint here is a calligraphy, because calligraphy depicting the person intellect, the person on a higher, I would say, a class, because there's, you know, classifications of society, different classes is very clear at that time. Again, this is, you know, during the I would say 7th century going forward in China. Again, when I say Asian art, and here I'm depicting Chinese painting, just to show the point. It's not meant to be a comprehensive studies of Asian art, but for the Asian society, you started out. If you look at the classical painting and use landscape as an example first. When you first look at it, do you ask questions like, why is the East have so many painting of bamboos? And again, on the slide, I made a mistake. West should be East and East should be West. So again, my dyslexia problem shows again. So on the paintings of all the bamboo, that's the Eastern paintings, and on the right is the Western paintings. But have you noticed that painting in the East has a lot of depictions of the plants, of the sky, the mountains, and everything is in a two-dimensional context instead of three-dimensional, because dimension was never an issue, an emphasis. And further, colors, you know, where the East is all mostly on ink, and then for the West is mostly depicted in color. Well, one is the advance of this, you know, focus on searching for the color coming from nature. But in the East, because the emphasis was always about self-cultivation, you don't paint so that you can express the self. You paint because you need to follow the master who want to show his inner being to be harmonized with nature. And if you are a gentleman, you are supposed to know how to do calligraphy. And if you know calligraphy, then you have to know how to depicting what nature offers you. So the expression here is not to depicting what show in nature, but what it means to the society, what the nature means to us human. And nature is, like I said, is paramount. It's always paramount. So the painting is a way of expressing the relationship, the human with nature, which is human almost doesn't exist. Nature is the focus here. And because of that, the self-expression is through all these bamboos. And because that bamboo here represent a gentleman. And when I say gentleman, it's because gentlemen back then is everything. Women, we were not allowed to go to school. But for the elite, those who are wealthy and who want to marry off to a good families, then she needs to know calligraphy. And because she needs calligraphy, then she knows how to paint. Again, but through using the ink. The emphasis here is about how she can serve her husband, her son, or her brother, not to serve, to express herself. But most women do not paint bamboo, because the bamboo is to designate, to show the character of a gentleman. So when you look at the painting of the bamboos, it's not really depicting what they see out there in the yard, but what it is represent as you as a character. Are you somebody who will be straight in the wind and will not bound to anything, or are you flexible enough to bend in the wind? The way how the leaves depicting, the way how the tree is being bent, there's the code that needs to be dissected. In the old days for China, the message in painting is not just merely painting, but it's all kinds of messages encoding, you know, because the individual cannot criticize, the individual cannot criticize the society. So when you say that, you're gonna offend people, and you don't want to offend people. So you sometimes when you want to criticize certain thing, you criticize inside a painting. So some painting, if you read it from left to right, it has one meaning, and if you read it from right to left, it has another meaning. Painting here is, like I said, there's a fundamental difference between East and West, And the Eastern started out as a craftsmanship, but then it focused on how to cultivate the self. So if you use painting not to paint so you could show off to your neighbor, but you paint because you want to train yourself to show that you are a gentleman. So if you look at the painting, do you see a gentleman? Not really. You see that the gentleman is humble enough that he is now become part of the sage, part of the painting. And the painting is usually the individual is, and his life is so small compared to the paramount of nature. And nature being depicted here is, the concept of heaven. And heaven, a dragon representing heaven. The king is the son of heaven. So dragon is the symbolic illustration of what representing what is the, because they don't believe in God, but they do believe in heaven. And so heaven here, because there's something that cannot be explained. Heaven is paramount and heaven had its own power. And here the painting, usually they try to use the dragon veins, meaning that, the mountain, the tree, all of that, you can see the hidden dragons embodied in the painting. But in the oh my God, I missed one slide. So in the West, on the other hand, it's usually depicting the stories from Bible, stories from past society, story from the current society, and human here is in the playground, like Adam and Eve, and having a good time with nature. The concept of humbleness or things like that was not there. And there's, even though there are messages embodied in the painting sometimes, but mostly it just to tell the story. It's not focusing on self-cultivation, focusing on self progress that the person's made. And also, like I said, the other differences is that the Eastern arts is a little bit subtle. You have to take your time. You have to read it. You have to contemplate, why did the bamboo look this way? Why is it bending? Why the line is this way? And another key differences also is that it's always trying to look at the harmony. You never show the painting that there is the disharmony in the painting. And so graceful line, softer line, and instead of straight line. But in Western painting, because realism is the ideal, so realism is depicting the society, the image of what God give you, and so that you could have the horizontal line, you can have line that go up and down. Sorry, I missed one slide here so that I couldn't show that to you, but you're just gonna have to imagine it, all right? Imagine all those paintings in the old day depicting Bible stories. It has, the lines, vertical line, horizontal line. Again, there's no restriction to that. But in Eastern painting, usually you don't see straight line. And again, the emphasis was never about originality. It's you can have one depictions of a mountain and a stream that being painted over and over again by many people. And the painting is not to show, hey, I can paint, but to show that I learned from my master. I know how to follow the great masters, and not to show off like, hey, I have these new skills, but to show that, master, I can follow you. So conformity is everything, not about being a non-conformist, but in the West, is to show, sometimes paint to show you are different from the rest, to show you you can think better, you can come up with new invention to express yourself. So the first and foremost, it's not about conformity, but in the Asian culture, conformity is everything. Because if you don't conform, especially during the Confucius time, it was a wartime, it was a chaotic time. So the emphasis has always been, there's a rule to society, there's class. Society is already been classified, and you have to follow the rules, and you have to follow the mold that is given to you. If you are the son of a king, you shall be king. If you are the son of a beggar, you become a beggar. You become, if you are a son of a bread baker, you become a baker. That's the way it is. So so I have this slide from to depict some of the Vietnamese modern art, and I showed it in here just for fun. Because again, there will be another lecture. If people are interested, then we can talk about the modern arts between Chinese art versus American art, or the Vietnamese art versus Chinese art. There's all kinds of fun thing that you can look through. So, but here I'm saying to the people that there's certain emphasis of the Eastern art is linger in Vietnamese art, but as the modern art invading Vietnam, things start to shift, things start to change. In the past, the classical is always focused in the individual in the society, not the individual, but to herself, and it's not to criticize the society. But modern art, as you can see in the middle, is to criticize war, to depicting. This is a Vietnamese American artist who using the girls who got burned in a naval bomb time, and use that as an anti-war. So because in the Western art, usually we have art critics who give define an era, define a certain school of thoughts, define, and everything is a structure with studies that delve in it. For me, as an art activist, who I try to come back and do research on Vietnamese art history. Again, there was no such existence at the time that I was searching for it. And people don't try to define things. Like I asked, for example, I asked a question like why the Mac ceramics, the Mac dynasty ceramic is so different than the rest of other dynasties, and no scholar could answer me. So it took me a long time to interview people, to ask a question, and and then I found the answer. And because the answer lays in the research that's done by the French scholars and not by the Vietnamese scholars. Things probably changed now, but back then in the 90s when I was doing the research, it was the French scholars that give me their inputs on what they view of Vietnamese art. And because the discipline was just not there. Again, because in Asian culture, art was never considered as a school. The point here is that it just using as a tool to do self-cultivation. It was not until the industrialization happened that the French came to Vietnam and start, having the academy input in the Vietnam society. At that time, suddenly art become a school, a discipline to follow and to study. So, so there's no ism in Eastern art, but there's a lot of ism in Western arts, right? So here, this picture here is just to show you that in the West, things are, you go into different, like the school of thoughts, and to address an issue of the society, an issue that needs to be addressed, a social condition. Here, this is protesting on the killing in a country in Africa. But in the Eastern, again, it's not to use as a criticize the society. So there will be a lack of that, like this kind of protest. But with the Western art coming in and the influence that now beginning their Eastern artists, Asian artists begin to use the modern method to depicting criticizing the society. Here on the left, this is the artist is criticizing the Vietnam War. In the middle, criticizing the Vietnam society, where they worship communism. and people are starving, or they are not even human anymore. It look kind of abnormal. So but I like to go back onto the concept, the differences between Eastern and Western art, that I think is a fun fact, where in Eastern art, like I said, painting was never about religion. And then religion, like I said, it was just a lack of that until people start making Buddhism into religions. Then they start painting Buddhas and so forth. But originally it was not so. But in the West, is heavily emphasized on Christianity. It heavily emphasized either to celebrate God or to criticize God. And to the modern art, then this become the language of criticism, the language of criticize the society. And so you will see, like in the Eastern art, when they finally learn how, for the Vietnamese society, when they finally learn to depict, to paint as a decorative item, to record things in history or in the society, it's always there is the aesthetic of showing something's pretty, instead of a criticism. Instead of criticizing society, the depiction is about life itself. And this is I'm talking about modern art. But like I said, in the old days, it was not so at all. So at this point, I would like to open to questions if anybody have questions for me.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And yes, we did receive a few questions during your lecture. And the first is more of a discussion question, but we'd love to get your thoughts. So the question is, do you find that Eastern art has too much Western influence and is losing its footing and culture?
So for now, we're talking about modern art, right? In modern arts, because of the globalizations, there's the openness between boundaries now. So there's a lot of influence now from the West to the East, and things changed rapidly. There's and again, I'm not an expert to say, but I would say that philosophical wise, yes, it has changed dramatically. And it start being artists now being used art as a medium to criticize society, to address social issues, not like before. But there's still this male gaze, and I'm single out Vietnamese art for now. That there's still this male gaze in Vietnamese art, in a sense that the women always look in a certain way. She's look feminine. She looks pretty. Again, it's now they take in the concept of decorative purpose. So you paint something. You paint a beautiful woman. One is nostalgia for the old days. Because the woman is supposed to be to have four virtues, which is the four virtues is all about worshiping your man counterpart instead of cultivating yourself. And again, the concept of cultivation of the self has always been reserved for men. It was not for women. And so back then, the man need to know calligraphy, so he showed that he has he's a learning here. And then second, he has to do it well, just as good as the master, but not to be better than the master. But if you go to Taiwan National Art Museum, and you just walk through the time, it's amazing. You can see the changes, with time as you go forward toward the period that closer to us. Then you see the bamboo. I'm taking bamboo as an example because there's just so many bamboo paintings, and people have to understand bamboo is not to depict bamboos. Bamboos here are the character of the gentleman. And so when you look at one bamboo versus another, look at it and see what that person is trying to tell you. Sometimes it looks exactly like the one you saw before, but there are subtle differences, like where the lights come in, where the bone of the bamboo stem, it shows either you are the person that who always strict to your principle, or yet your principle can be changed, with time, and can reflect the power that coming to you. Is the power coming from the west or the east? You know, you look at the way how the bamboo bend. You look at the leaves. Is the leaf always pointing down, or there's some leaf pointing up, and there are more leaves pointing up than more leaves pointing down? All of that has meanings. Those are a lot of classical art, but in modern art, I think I would defer to another discussion, but I would say for you for now, yes, there's a major influence between the Western art and Eastern arts, and Eastern arts now move away from its traditional sense, meaning the tool to cultivate the self. Now it becomes the tool to expressing the self and to criticize the society.
Thank you, Jenny. That's really interesting. And it would be interesting to hear about more symbols, such as the bamboo, that commonly depicted a character of a person instead of being what it was literally. There's another, sorry, I have another question from someone, or would you want to go on?
I just want to point out about symbolism, motifs. So the symbols, so in order to understand the Eastern arts, you really have to understand the symbols. So, you know, what heaven means, what bamboo represent, what dragon represent, what the koi represent, the fish, the birds, the mountain, the stream, how, and also negative space versus positive space. Why? If you notice, most of the classical Chinese paintings, there's always positive and negative space, meaning that there's a in Vietnamese we call động tĩnh. You know, there's where's the noise and where's the silent. So because it represents the philosophy of yin and yang, it gotta be harmonized. It's not to show a discord or a discomfort. But in Western art, the modern artists beginning to learn that concept and influenced by that. And now you see a lot of modern artists use the concept of negative space and positive space, but this has been exist in the East for a long time. So you hardly see a painting, especially in the old days, the painting that there's just completely positive space that fill the entire screen and no negative space, because then you have no room to breathe. So when you look at the painting, you're supposed to feel there's silence, there is yin in the yang. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that is so interesting. Thank you. And as a reminder to everyone on this call, if you have more questions that come up, if you're curious about the symbolism and more ways to notice the positive and the negative spaces, feel free to ask your questions in the chat, as I'll be reading them aloud in the order they're sent. So we have another interesting question from Wilson Young, and he said, and I think he's referring to slide number 16, I think the man in the picture is looking at the far side, and we can only see his back instead of his face. Does that symbolize that he is expressing his discontent of what he has encountered, or his fate, as the ancient poems always expressed?
Which one is this?
Is it the one? 15? Was it slide 15? Wilson, feel free to unmute yourself.
I can't really see the number on my screen.
Okay.
But you know, you can.
It's the one where the Chinese man is looking out. So it's if you scroll down to like 3 more slides, you'll see it. This one.
Right. Was it this slide here, Wilson?
Is that the one? So again, I'm gonna simplify the answer here. Is that when men being depicted in the painting, and mind you, this painting is further to the present than the other paintings. As you go further back in time, then man depicting himself less and less, and almost you can't even see men in the paintings. Usually, it just so as you move more and more to the current time, then the paintings show the man illustrated more. In this one, you see the gentleman. He's a gentleman for sure because the way he dressed. You can see that he's a scholar. He's not a peasant. You look at him, you know that he's a philosopher of some kind, and he's contemplating with nature. He's looking at the bird. The birds are, two of them, but one is flying. There gotta be a message there. Should I stay? Should I go? Sometimes when you're discontent with the current society, you don't go out and say it out loud to the king, because if you do that, and if they find out that you criticize the king or those in power, then you will be what they call a chu yi tam tok, meaning that you will be killed for all 3 generations. Not just yourself, but your 3 generations will be gone. And the philosophy of eliminate all the way to the roots. So that's another philosophy that very heavily influenced the West nowadays. In the old days, it was the West, it was the East who had this concept. If you eliminate anyone that's your enemy, that you don't like, for whatever they say, you need to eliminate the entire clan. You cannot just eliminate that one person, because even that is a baby. That baby will grow up and go back and to kill you. And so because of this harsh ramifications, that people would not dare to speak up, and those who dare to speak up, then that's the end for them, right? So in this one, if you are not happy with the king, you are not happy with the emperor, you're not happy with the society, you show yourself and your relationship with nature. And in this one, if you can see, it is seemed to be a very harmonized painting, right? A man has just maybe just relaxing, looking into the wilderness, into the clear. But if you notice, there's a wind here, and the wind blowing in certain way. You see it because looking at the leaves, you see the leaves are tilted to one side, and it tilted to the right. So we don't know what the right means. And then there's a bird that who stay and the bird that who leaves. And you can see 2 birds are not together. So that is, I think Wilson is, I think you are on something there. Again, I would not want to be myself as an expert who interpret, but again, it's just my interpretation. And you are correct in looking at this painting, showing there is some sort of a displease of this individual to the society, and that's possible. But you see, it's so subtle that you really have to dig in and to understand it. And you notice another thing in the back of that painting, there's another individual, much smaller. And I don't know if that person is carrying something like almost maybe there's something that person is carrying, and there gotta be a meaning to that. There gotta be a meaning to this painting beside the fact that he's not happy with the society. You can see that it's not 100% harmonized. But if you go back in time, the further you go back into the history of Chinese landscape paintings, usually it's all about harmony. It's not about being displeased with the society.
Thank you, Jenny. I noticed that Tom O'Reilly had raised his hand. Did you want to unmute yourself and say something? Oh, sorry, you're still muted. There we go.
My question was about that tiny little guy on the left. I mean, obviously the artist is very skilled, but that perspective is totally weird. Is that a usual thing in art from this period, to have that weird perspective where the minor characters are tiny?
So for me, it's that every little thing, every little details in the painting is a message. It code and uncode. You have to decode the messages. Like I said, there's many paintings. Unfortunately, what I learned in the past, I could not find it today on internet. But when I was in school, we have a painting that we studied that it's just amazing that just by reading the painting from left to right, in calligraphy, you have to read in certain way to understand calligraphy. So they put that into painting as well. So it's all about messages. The displease of society and things like that it began to sneak into painting, and every single details in there, there's a story to be told. It's not there for accident. And you are correct in pointing out, look at the scale. Look at the scale. It seems like this is even though it's kind of, the perspective is very, a little bit of a realism here, but the person in the back is totally not to the scale, right? It show, and usually if you go to, you study Japanese painting, you will see the scale is everything. You know, if you worship somebody, or you know, like Buddha during the wartime, the scale of Buddha just become giant. You know, so people, when they say, oh, you know, you see all these Buddhist paintings or sculpture, they are huge. Well, they're huge for a reason. It's because when society is going so bad, when there's so much famine and killings, people make the Buddha look bigger so that they can receive blessings. So this is a kind of like bribery in the old days. And so here, when they one individual is bigger than the other, they're clearly a message to say, you know, he is a noble man, he is a wise man, he is a big man, and then, you know, he perhaps displeased about a society that is affecting the common man, the peasants that in the back. So, you know, again, why that person in the back so small? And not only that, you don't see his face or her face, versus this gentleman in the middle, you actually see the details of that person's face, but not the other person. So there ought to be messages that need to be decoded. And like I said, you know, there's so many ways you can interpret it, but for me, my interpretation here is that that, you know, this displays of this artist, I mean, of this gentleman about the society, has to do something about how policy affecting the common man or those who are peasants.
Thank you, Jenny. I have a couple of things to share. So right now there is a poll that you can all access on Zoom. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. Feel free to answer that poll as we continue to share questions with Jenny. Jenny, I noticed that somebody raised their hand. To that individual, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question if you'd like, or leave it in the chat. Okay, and so the next question I'm actually going to highlight is also from Tom O'Reilly. Are there surviving examples of Asian artists who rebelled against the tradition of classical times?
Definitely. I don't have the names here with me, but you know, those master in the past, like Vương Duy, we call it in Vietnamese. I think in English it's Wang Huy, or those of his counterparts during that era is all about, you know, projecting the almighty of nature. But as time goes, you know, toward the toward the end of the Tang dynasty, things become chaotic. People become displeased with the society. Then there's more emphasis on you know, the artists who begin to show his discontent with the society. But it's so incredibly subtle. You have to really dissect it. You have to study the painting, like the one we just talked about, to see the differences, why this person is not happy. And you have to get your own interpretation. There's one painting I remember, again, I could not find it here, is that when there's one emperor that he just didn't care about the nation, he really just want to have fun. He go to brothels. He's, you know, he has a lot of harems with many women in the back of the palace, and yet he was never happy. He would just want to enjoy his life, and he didn't care about the society. So there's a painting showing that the emperor arrived at a celebration of some sort. And so you read from right to left, then you see the emperor is saying hello, and everybody's bound to him and have a good time, so about to have a good time. But if you read from left, from right to left, then you see he just finished with the girl in the back of the painting, and he waving goodbye. He's leaving the scene, and everybody, probably really distressed after his visit, because when the emperor visits someplace, you always scared to death that you're gonna be killed. So yeah, there was those that who use painting to depict the displeased, but like I said, it buried so deep that scholars today have to dig it up, because if you do it so blatant, it can be easily interpreted, then you get killed. And it's not just you, but your entire clan.
Thank you, Jenny. And also, we have a comment from Hung Kyu Do. Feel free to unmute yourself right now, and you can ask your question.
Thank you, Jenny. So to the point that we are talking about the person who is at the lower left-hand corner, in the beginning, you mentioned that in the Eastern world, when we talk about leadership or higher position in the society, that image is a lot bigger and a lot higher or larger in the painting. And I think this is an example to prove that point. But at the same time, in the Eastern world, where we have a scholar or high position in the government, and they are looking at how to improve a country situation, sometimes they have vision. And then those moments, this is where people kind of express themselves. They look into space and start thinking and they say, how do I make things better? How do I create things so that it is beneficial to the community? So this is another point that I see in the painting. And looking, as you pointed out about the birds, the thing here is so vasted, and it's great that the way you have expressed. My point is just to kind of bring it back to the slide where you show the difference between the West and the East about leadership. Thank you.
Awesome, and that's a great catch. And I think that this is a good example of that, to show the man here questioning the world, and maybe perhaps have a conversation with nature, like, what should I do? Should I stay or should I leave? Another moment of Hamlet in a way, right? But I love the thing you point out is that the depictions of the nobleman, of the leader, is always bigger than those are below him. And clearly the scale effect here. Everything else seemed to be with scale, right? Everything else in the paintings seemed to be with the correct perspective, with everything to scale correctly, except for the humans. And I can't emphasize enough to bring you back into Buddhism paintings. If you, again, the scale of depictions of the Buddha has everything to do with how reflecting the society at the time. If you're facing famine, or let's say if you study the Silk Road, the history of the Silk Road, and in history of the Silk Road, people have to pass the Western desert, the Gobi Desert. And usually there's a lot of bandits, right? And sandstorm. So people, vendors or caravans who go through to sell silk or spices face a lot of challenges because the bandits, or because of the sandstorm, they die all the time. So then they start using Buddhist icons to help them, because they believe that the icon, the Buddha is with me, so Buddha will bless me. So the painting during that time is totally different than a society that have no challenges, no problems, or not facing famine or wartime. So that, again, messages is encoded in the painting or the sculpture as tremendous. For example, in Chinese sculpture for Buddhist, for Wang Ying, so that would say the female Buddha. Well, I can tell you, in the old days, there's no such thing as female Buddha. Again, the Buddhism was putting focus on men, right, at the center of the philosophy, not women. And so, but when Buddhism entered China, it needs to adapt to the Chinese society. So Chinese society did not have Buddhism, and they only just worship ancestors. Ancestors are people that were with you to eternity. So they are the one that we're focusing in. So it was never a higher being in the sky that needs to be worshipped. It's just the abstract of nature is heaven. That's it. And so Buddhism needs to adapt to Chinese society in order to stay. And they never look at Shakyamuni, which is Buddha, as a figure to be worshipped because he's a male. Male is not represent nurturing, loving. Male looked at as a figure of a protector, but in wartime, and give authority, giving orders, but not loving or nurturing. So a male Buddha have to become a female in order to have that. So the Chinese culture start depicting the sculpture of the male Buddha, but in a feminine way. And as time goes by, and you notice, then they start having the female Buddha. But if you look at the female, the Kuan Yin character, if anybody have female Buddha in your home, take a look at the sculpture. Notice she has no breasts. She doesn't have breasts. And notice that her dress is very low cut, because in the old days, it was a tanga almost that put over the male Buddha. So that's why it can go so low. It just show the whole chest. But in the female Buddha, when it evolved and become female, it got low cut. And there's no breast because it was originally a male and not a female. But Chinese make that into a female so that she become somebody who is loving and nurturing, and therefore give birth to the concept of Kuan Yin. Before that, there was no such thing. So conveniently, like I said, in sculpture, in painting, a lot of Asian art, if we can call it art. Again, in the old day, it was never defined as art. We, as a Western scholar, coming in and start giving it name. But for the Asian society, basically these are just items that support life, or the tools to support the cultivation of the self. So therefore, there's no school of thought or things like that until much later. And there's no discipline. It took, when I was studying art history, it took us a lot of time to unravel some of the concepts, some of the things going on. You have to understand history to understand it. But there was no real study or discipline of, Chinese art history or Korean art history or Japanese art history until much later now. So in any ways, I'm sorry that I run on a little bit, but I just thought that's a little bit interesting tidbits.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So it is a little past 1 o'clock, so we are going to end now. Jenny, I do have a couple more questions that came in, so if you have a question you'd still like to ask, feel free to stay on a little bit after this announcement. Everyone completed the Zoom announcements, the Zoom poll, so thank you very much for that. And if you have any sort of feedback or you have any kinds of ideas about future topics, feel free to email us at chopsticksalleyart@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Chopsticks Alley Art, and you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Chopsticks Alley. Also, Jenny, I don't know if you saw, but we have feedback from Wilson Young. He said, Jenny is very knowledgeable about some of the religions in China, and I think this is why she is proficient in her area. Thank you. We also have thank yous coming in from Han-Kyu Do and from Case Hill. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. And we will see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure and it was an honor. I have to say that usually I do better in a live audience in person. This is my first time doing this, doing art lecturing in this format. So hopefully you bear with me a bit today.
You did great. Thank you so much, Jenny. And with the polls too, people seem to really enjoy the talk. So we'll definitely continue these lecture series. And as an audience, if there are certain topics you want us to talk about, or if you have something interesting you want to share and become our expert, we would welcome that as well.